Good morning, everybody. I got some more stories for you today. Hope you enjoy these things and hope you get something out of them. But I'm going to jump into this thing. We're going to try to make sure it ain't too long today because I know some of you guys are busy and you need to get on with your day. This is that same country shop where I was at a couple of weeks ago. You know, I go by there every now and then. This incidentally, this little Tempo you see in the background is one of those Tempo diesels that had that Mazda diesel engine in it. Those things ran like a clock, and they got about 50 or 60 miles to the gallon. You know, if you had something like that, why would you even need a hybrid, you know? And this 1950 Hudson that's in the foreground was parked there, and he had that at his shop for a while. And it had spent a lot of his life in a barn. It was in pretty much good shape. And he had it on the lift that one day when I went in there, and I decided I'd have a look at that thing. And it's always interesting to look underneath one of these old cars like this. This 50 model Hudson. I had seen one time there was a commercial where they were showing a clip from a 1949 ad for saying the 49 Hudson is the car for you, and it had a bunch of women dancing out there in front of the car. I always think about that. But this thing had a little weak looking frame to me, and the sway bar was a little skinny thing, like you know nowadays you see real heavy duty sway bars and they have them on the front and the rear. And so it was really interesting to look at this thing. Look at this master cylinder. There's the master cylinder. Here's the stoplight switch, and this mechanical linkage is in place so that it will still apply the brakes even if the hydraulics fail. Isn't that interesting? So if your hydraulics fail, this linkage going back here will actually, it's belt and suspenders. That's what I call it. So, you know, I don't know how many vehicles had this, but I did notice it on this one, and it was just an interesting thing right there to me. And it's interesting too that you got a plate right above that. See that right there? And so there must have been, they felt like there must have been some reason why you would want to not raise the car up, but take that plate out of the floorboard and reach through here and maybe adjust this. I'm not exactly sure what that was about. I hadn't really researched that all that much. Now, they had a wet clutch, and this wet clutch was swimming in oil. One formula told me that 8 ounces of kerosene mixed with 8 ounces of engine oil is what you were supposed to pour in there, and it was supposed to be changed out regularly. And then you got this Permatex clutch fluid for Hudsons. You see that? And the clutch had pieces of cork on it. That's actually a picture of the cork clutch for one of these. It's supposed to be swimming in this clutch fluid. Now some of the, I have seen some of the heavy equipment that I worked on when I was down in Texas had wet clutches. And as a matter of fact, the starter had a seal so that when it was bolted up to the bell housing, that oil from that wet clutch would not get into the starter and mess it up. But and we occasionally we'd have to pull one of those 40MT Delco starters off and send it to the starter shop and get it resealed because it would get oil in it, and oil would start dripping out of the starter housing, you know. But anyway, it's just old technology. This hard body truck had a 3-liter engine in it, had a hot buck jerk condition, like drove owner crazy. It ran good cold, but when it was hot, it would buck and jerk. And this guy had changed everything on this thing. Well, we got the optical distributor. You know, this thing's got a plate that's mounted in between two, an LED emitter and a detector. And when that plate spins, it provides us signals for cam and crank, believe it or not. And that's something that's fairly common on a lot of those Asian cars, these optical distributors. Sometimes they would fail. I mean, I've had to replace a few of them over the years and all that. But one way or another, replacing a distributor got most of it. You can tell when you've done something that has changed whatever's going on. But if it doesn't get it all, you know, there's either 2 problems or something else is happening. And so pull the plugs out, you know, because he had changed the plug. He had used anti-seize on the plug threads. And one plug looked different from the rest of them. Had a little brown stain on it, ceramic, you know, that's your grasping at straws, but anything, you know. So we measured the center electrode resistance, and from 4 to 6,000 ohms of what we were getting, you know. The Ford specs back whenever I was in engine performance school said no more than 8,000 for that center electrode. one plug looked suspicious, so we changed that. You know, that didn't do anything. But while we was driving the thing with a scope connected, and this is sort of a recreation of what we were seeing, we saw this wonky waveform. This is actually what the waveform looks like on one of these. You know, it's a digital thing because of that, those little square holes going past those LEDs. This peculiar trace sometimes would, when it was going on, it would look like a sound foul in strange looking thing. And this was while that bucking and jerking was going on, see. Alright, so we went ahead and put another distributor in it and fixed that. Well, in other words, a second distributor. This 2006 F-150, I dropped by the Ford place that same day when I left that other shop, and the ignition timing kept defaulting to 0 when he had a low power concern. Well, the Ford hotline condemned the engine. They said due to noise from the crankshaft thrust bearing fooling the knock sensor into retarding the timing. Now, why in a Sam Hill they would want to replace the engine for that? And this is the Ford hotline people. You know, hey, whatever. You know, if they want to throw an engine in, that's what we'll do. I don't know how that one turned out, but there was one that was a 2005 F-150 that we worked on at the college, and we put thrust bearings in it. That was part of what we did because of an oil pressure concern that it had. It was, you know, if you get less than 25 psi of oil pressure, it won't operate the cam. I mean, the timing chain tensioner like it should, and you'll get rattling in the front of it and all that kind of stuff. And so we were working on that. Incidentally, a lot of people may not know this, but you can buy the camshaft, you know, where it spins in those saddles in the head with the little camshaft caps. It doesn't have bearings. The camshaft just spins in that head like a dadgum lawnmower. I never understood why they didn't put bearings in there, but they didn't. And so on this particular one, the oil pressure, when we got through with all of the work we did, we put an oil pump on it, we put timing chain tension, put the whole schmear on it, and it was, the oil pressure was a lot better. You know, the engine wouldn't even run when it came to us on that one. And the engine was a whole lot better, but the oil pressure was still low, so we went ahead and put bearings in it. And this is part of that process here, the thrust bearings right there. And it was a girl that did this job. She did a good job of it. And it ran really good when she got done. But the thing about it is, it still, whenever it would get hot, the oil pressure would dip down to the point of where the timing chain was starting to rattle a little bit. And I found out later, and I don't know why I didn't know this before, you can actually buy replacement cam bearing caps. And heck, you can get those things from Amazon. And I was thinking, you know, I wonder what it would have been like. The guy didn't want to, he'd already spent $2,500 on this thing by the time we got through. It was running, and he decided he was going to put some motor honey in it and just drive it that way, you know. And it ran smooth, except for that when it would get really hot, the pressure would get down close to 25, and then it would start to rattle a little bit. So anyway, I don't know how that turned out in the end, but he drove away happy that, you know, and he didn't want to spend any more money. But we could pull the valve covers on that thing, rocker arm covers, and if we could have replaced all of those cam bearing caps, I wonder what that would have done to the oil pressure. Some of you guys might have done this, you might know, but the fact that you can buy those cam bearing caps is amazing to me. I stumbled across that looking around online, and they've got them at Amazon. So it's amazing the stuff that you learn just doing research, you know. At a different Ford dealer, Jimmy drew a ticket on a 2003 Expedition with 99,000 miles on it at the time, and an intermittent stumble that ranged from a mild hesitation to a snort and an induction backfire and stalling whenever you snap the throttle. It was really wacky. And so it had to idle a couple of minutes before the symptom would happen. And a previous technician that had it before they passed it down to Jimmy had performed TSB 04-1409, which involved replacing the alternator to battery harness. You know, you can see this stuff right, and for the code that it had, he popped that on there, PO320 and 620, blah blah, and that didn't do any good. But he did the TSB, you know, and TSBs are good. They're our friend. I'm not against TSBs. I've fixed a lot of stuff with technical service bulletins. That saves you from having to go and dig and hunt and be the first person that ever found something like that, or the first time you ever found it. Well, this predictable induction backfire, we were able to look at the IDS while we had this thing, and it had a, while this was going on, I noticed it was retarding the fuel trim. I mean, you know, it was subtracting fuel. Now, if you've got a lean induction backfire, why are you subtracting fuel? Is this the cause, or is it related some other kind of way? So it wasn't handling the fuel consistently in these critical zones, and so it was going from 0 to 16 negative, and it was happening really fast. And so replaced the PCM, reflashed and all that kind of, you know, and flashed it with as-built data from this truck. And believe it or not, it changed the behavior of that thing. Whenever, even during the time it was induction backfiring, it would go up to plus 22.5. So something was going on there. Something had changed. But the thing about it is, if the thing's still not fixed, this doesn't mean much. Now, this is something you can look at to try to get an indication. Well, maybe you got too much alcohol in the fuel. It's not a flex fuel vehicle, so maybe somebody pumped a bunch of E85 into it. And so he says, well, he didn't have a graduated tube like you need to do this kind of thing. And so here we do. We got a straight container. It's got to be a straight, like a rain gauge, like I talked about before. Got a tape measure, and we marked it at half-inch intervals. And we filled the thing up with 90% fuel and added 10% water and shook it up. And see, however much you gain over this 10% mark is how much alcohol is in the fuel, because the alcohol is going to mix with the water. It's going to leave the fuel and mix with the water, and you can tell by this. And what it did was it only had like 8%, so that's not enough to make any difference. You know, that was a nice little test. Always good to check your fuel. There was a Dodge pickup that came to us one time, and this guy said, I filled my Dodge pickup up with fuel, and it didn't drive hardly anywhere before it quit running. And he says, and I know there must be something, the water in that gas or something. And so we brought it in there, and what I always like to do, if I have any idea there's water in the fuel, is I always like to take a container or a set of containers that's going to be big enough to hold all the fuel that's in that vehicle. I disconnect the fuel line from the fuel rail, and I put an extension hose on it or whatever, and I put it into these containers, like, you know, empty 5-gallon cans or whatever that you can look there and see. And I run that fuel pump, you know, bypass the fuel pump relay, and I run the fuel pump until all of the fuel has gone out of that tank, every last drop that I can get out of it. And on these newer vehicles, since the fuel pump is all the way down on the bottom of the tank anyway, to deal with any water that condenses and settles in there, you're typically going to see any water that's in there. Well, we emptied every last bit of the fuel out of that Dodge truck into these big white 5-gallon buckets so we could look down in there and see it. Was not a single drop of water in that thing anywhere. The fuel looked good, it smelled good. You could put it in there. I felt maybe it's got diesel, put it in there, waved it around. You know, whenever it dries off, if it's got diesel in it, you can smell it with your fingers. Didn't smell anything like that. It smelled good, it looked good. I couldn't see anything wrong with that gas. But just on a whim, I got our gas tanker over there, which had gas from the, you know, college pump out there, and I pumped about 3 gallons of the college gas in there, which I always charged them for that on the ticket when we did that. And that thing cranked right up. To this very day, I have no earthly idea what was wrong with that gas. It didn't look bad, it didn't look rotten, it was the right color, it smelled right, but that truck would not run on that gas. Now, I don't know how much gas he put in there, because the tank was only about half full when we pumped all that stuff out of it. But that's the only time I've ever had an experience like that. Usually you can look at the gas or smell of it or test it or something and tell what's going on. And that gas we tested for alcohol too, and it didn't have a bunch of alcohol in it either, so that was weird. Jimmy finally discovered by process of elimination that one of the cop coils was causing the problem, and whenever he would he unplugged one cop coil at a time, and he retested, and he kept going and going and going, and finally when he unplugged one of them, I don't remember which one it was, that problem was gone. He replaced that one cop coil, and all that trouble went away. Now, those cop coils will do weird stuff. A lot of the times they do stuff on Lincolns and whatnot, where they'll make wacky stuff happen on the instrument cluster and all kind of hogwash like that. And I actually had somebody that emailed me one time and was asking me, hey, I've got this crazy stuff going on. I think I've got serious electrical problems. And I says, what you've probably got is a bad cop coil that's creating radio frequency interference, and it's confusing the engine controller, and it's making it do that. And he said that and I can't remember how many cop coils that Lincoln had on it, but anyway, he said he replaced all those cop coils and he didn't have any more trouble, because he didn't want to track down which one it was, and it won't throw you a code typically. So here I was, one time I told you about that Oldsmobile that this lady that I knew says it was an '86 Oldsmobile with a little four-cylinder and that little injector in the throttle body up there. And I mentioned this one time before, I think, but anyway, she says, hey, my car quit on the way home, and I was about ready to leave work anyway. I said, well, I'll come by there and have a look at it, because she had just crossed the traffic circle and the car sputtered and quit, and she pulled in and she'd crank it up and try to run, and it'd die. And so I opened the hood, took the air cleaner top off. She cranked it up, and after the engine died, the injector kept squirting fuel. I said, I ain't never seen nothing like that lately. So I got to notice that I was smelling something burning, and I looked down there, and there was smoke coming out of the engine cooling fan. It was running, but there was smoke coming out of it because it was the windings were partially shorted. I unplugged the engine cooling fan, and I told her, I said, start it up again. So she started up again. It ran perfect. And all it took to fix that one was an engine cooling fan, because it was creating radio frequency interference and sweeping it all through the engine compartment. You know, that was an isolated incident too. But we were always taught, well, in the early years of fuel injection, if you have an idea that some kind of a radio frequency interference problem under the hood is causing the computer to be confused because of the induction of that RFI sweeping through those wires, if you turn the AM radio on and put it all the way to the low end of the AM band, it'll pick up that. And if it makes static at the same time you're having your problem, it's RFI that's causing it. Of course, you're going to have to find out where that is. But that low end of that AM band is extremely sensitive to this RFI. And as I remember, in the Vietnam War, jets had AM radio receivers that were set really, really on the low end, and when they were being painted by radar from a sound site, they would hear squawking static because of that. It was the same kind of deal. But anyway, just keep that in mind. It might help you one day. I bought these 3 cars at auction and sold them for a profit. These Crown Victorias had really high mileage. That car right there I sold to my son Luke. But these other 2 cars I sold to the same guy. He wanted to buy them both, and that was me and my dad. You know, we used to speculate on stuff. That was our last hurrah. I told him that these 3 cars were for auction at the college. I knew these cars because I was the one that my boys maintained them. You know, so I knew all these cars went into the other. That was an '02 model. That was an '01 model, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And that Taurus right there was an '04. Anyway, that was a cool little deal. Now this is my son Matt driving this little LTD. Well, that's actually, it was a little Marquis. No, let's see. It was a little LTD that I bought. I had bought a little Marquis at another time. And this guy had spent a fortune trying to fix his car. He worked at a parts store. My wife knew his wife, and she asked if we'd be interested in buying this car. And it was a really clean, nice car. And of course, it got terrible gas mileage. It had the 3.8 and the C5 transmission in it. And this thing, my son drove it, and it did something crazy. I figured out what was wrong with it, by the way. It had a bad catalytic converter. The catalytic converter was clogged up. And in those days, on an old car like that, I just paid $550 for it. I just took the catalytic converter off, which on that one, it just unbolts. You know, and you could see right down in there, you could tell it was all clogged up. And beat all the stuff out. This guy had replaced every electronic part on the engine. I don't know how much he spent on the thing, but all that stuff was new. And so I made sure everything was set up right, and the timing was set right, and all this, and beat all the crud out of the converter and put it back on. You know, this is not a state where they check emissions. And so I said, well, I'll drive it like this for a while and put a aftermarket converter on it later. But you know, I just want to make sure before I spend much of anything else on it. Well, I gave it to my son to drive when he was 18, just so he'd have something to ride. And I was driving next to him when I took this picture, and he has started having a problem where a bunch of transmission fluid would start boiling out of the vent and blowing out behind the back of the car, and this was just really annoying. And so what I did on this one, and I think probably what it was there must have been crud in the cooling system that was built up around the transmission cooler that was keeping it from cooling the transmission right, because that was built into the radiator. I put an external cooler on it, did a fluid and filter change, and replaced the modulator valve on the transmission, and all of that problem went away. And so that wasn't too hard to fix, but it just started happening, you know, more kind of suddenly, really. But it was boiling the fluid because it was getting too hot, and it was pushing it out the vent, and that was coming out behind the car driving down the road. It was really something to see, you know. Duct tape usually works. You know, these people, if they have an issue that they need to take care of, and I don't know, I've seen people, I saw a car the other day I didn't have a chance to take a picture of, that built an entire fender out of duct tape that was about the same color as the rest of the car. And it looked pretty good. It had character, I'll tell you that. People also will take translucent red tape and they'll build themselves a new tail light housing and that kind of stuff. You know, there's all kinds of what we do as human beings is we do whatever works. We're pragmatic, you know. And if duct tape works, you know, slap some on there and let it get you by for a while. This is something that I had taught my students to do. We were looking for a power steering leak on this Chevrolet, and I said, let's put some dye in there, and you got to make sure it's oil-based dye, not the kind that's coolant-based. Pour it in the power steering pump, doesn't hurt a dadgum thing. Turn the wheels back and forth, let it start leaking. Get that black light, you can see exactly where that power steering comes from. Sometimes you can't tell, and on this one it was annoying trying to figure out where it was coming from because it, you know, was kind of blowing around under there and you couldn't really tell. And it turned out that we found out that there was an O-ring right here that was leaking, and that's where it was all coming. See, it was running down from above, so it was getting all over everything. Well, this is 22 minutes worth of video. I hope you got something out of it, and I really appreciate you guys listening. And I will see you fellas next week. Have a good week, and hey, let's be careful out there.